Cap Fact: the serum betrays the soldier. Towards the end of Mark Gruenwald's run on the character of Captain America, he wrote a story in which the super soldier serum not only started weakening, but started actively working against Steve Rogers. This resulted in bouts of paralysis and overall weakness that really hindered the character. Steve would first try to overcome this with just taking more gadgets, but eventually it got even worse, so he had to get fitted out in a mech suit made by Iron Man. But even that wasn't enough, and eventually Steve Rogers died for like an issue, because it's comic. Now, when I first read this story, it just seemed like an interesting story. But then as I learned more about what was happening in the world of comics at the time, it's not hard to see some parallels with what Mark Gruenwald was probably going through. This was being published in the mid-90s, like right after Image was founded and started, and the world of comics was very different than it had been before and even is now. This ranged from some pretty benign and silly stuff like shoulder pads getting bigger, and then there's some that's more debatable about there was rising violence in comics and more violent anti-heroes versus Cap, who's more straight-laced. And I don't mean this to denounce violence in comics, because there's got to be a level of that for superhero comics, and I think there should be a range for all audiences. But regardless, I think Mark didn't like where these were going, particularly with the characterization of heroes, where they weren't just being more violent, but just morally gray more than ever. And again, there's not necessarily a problem with more morally gray characters, but there was also a push for Captain America to become more like that. I mean, that's why John Walker was originally brought in as Captain America, is to push the envelope a little bit with the violence that Captain America could do. And this was towards the end of Mark's run on the character, not necessarily because he wanted to be off the character, but they had to make a change due to the lagging sales, and I think he knew they were going to push for something more like Image. I'm using them just as a generic stand-in because that's where the market kind of was, but comics in all companies were going more like this. So you have a writer who loves making comics and loves what comics were, who's now seeing them change into something he doesn't like and doesn't think is appropriate. And so it's not hard to look at what happens to Steve and wonder if it's a parallel to his own life.